I recently made a video where I did a drawing in real time, and I felt like today could be another good opportunity to make a drawing in real time and discuss something which I think is quite important for people who draw, and especially in portraiture. Again, I'm going to be using an envelope, and it's just that time of year where I'm getting so much mail that I have envelopes left over which I don't put in the recycling immediately. I like to doodle on them, and that gives me the opportunity to explore certain ideas and try and improve upon certain parts of my drawing. The first thing I'm going to do is some shading from light to dark. I'm sure you've seen this before, but it is very important. So if it's something which you haven't practiced, I encourage you to. Now, my pencil is quite soft. It's a Palomino Blackwing pencil, so that equates to something like a 6B, I believe, maybe slightly harder. But I feel like it can push like a 5 or 6B. And when I say push, I just mean go from light to quite dark. So this is what I'm doing here, is just trying to demonstrate the range of tone which this pencil can provide. And it's really important for this drawing in the video because that's the whole point of it, is not just to do a drawing with one pencil, but to explore a range of tones. And I really normally like to encourage people to do drawings with more than one pencil, but this is just a demonstration video and not based on portraiture in a longer session where you actually want to do a commission or you want to draw someone and give it as a gift or something which is a little bit more professional. This is just an exercise which I think is really good for artists, and I say it quite often to people who draw and create art about not doing outlines. Now I'm going to do a little box around this tone which I've drawn here, just to make it easier to see the light and dark scale that's been created. So technically creating an outline around the tone that I've been working on here. So to do the very, very light tone, I hold the pencil at the very top where the rubber is, and I just wobble it around and try to get it as consistent a coverage on the paper as possible, because that way I can keep a very light shading and I won't apply too much pressure. And then at the top end, something which I normally don't do, I'm actually pressing down harder, and I really do encourage people not to press down harder, but in this example here, I'm just being a bit impatient, to be honest. The reason why I say you shouldn't press down harder on the paper is because then you get your drawing to look shiny, and that doesn't look good. You can get just as dark a shade with your pencil by, instead of pressing down hard, by layering it on top, by keeping the pressure fairly equal. So not hard shading, just slightly more pressure than doing really light shading, and just going over it in different directions over and over again. So this is an example of how I hold the pencil to do the light shading. You can see I'm holding it where the rubber is at the very top of the pencil, and then just wobbling it along until I do have some kind of light coverage where I'm connecting the pencil with the paper. And that's what I mean. And then you can just slightly work over it, and you can see here I'm still holding it in the same place, and it is going darker and darker again, because lead will sit on top of it. It's not lead, sorry, but the actual a mixture of carbon and graphite, I believe, is sitting on top of itself quite comfortably if you just continually work it, and especially if you slightly change direction. That's something which I was shown about 4 or 5 years ago, is that if you slightly adjust the direction in which you shade, then the tone darkens and you have a very smooth blend of shading which starts to occur, and you don't see the pencil strokes anymore, which I think is a lovely feature of certain types of drawing. It's not always the desired effect, but it is certainly very effective. And again, I'm just creating a quick scale here, slightly larger, just to show how this is what we're trying to work with in this drawing. It's just good practice to make sure that you have that type of a range with the pencil that you're using. So if you have an envelope or a piece of paper, regardless of what your materials are, try this practice first before we start getting into the actual drawing, which we're going to use as a demonstration for drawing without outlines in this video, because I would love it if you could draw along with me. I find this quite an easy technique, especially drawing from imagination, but it works just as well from a reference as soon as you know how I'm breaking down drawing the face. That's why it might be easier to draw from imagination along with me this time, and then when you do draw a face, you should be able to do the same technique, even if tonally sometimes the reference that you're using, i.e. the model, will not necessarily always have the same tonality that we're going to explore with our drawing. That's something which you pull out of it regardless, so that you have the underlying structure of the face. So let's get started on this drawing. So here we are. The first thing that I start with is drawing the eye sockets. And because we're not doing outlines, we're trying to draw patches of tones. This is because usually the face has a very small amount of light on it. And we're not necessarily going to make the whole face covered in tone, but that doesn't really hurt either. But in this drawing, we are going to leave quite a lot of white still left on the subject. In other types of drawing, you can cover the whole face with tone that's not white and then either erase parts for light or take advantage of the fact that nothing is actually white and start to draw the tone with such a great range that you can then leave highlights. Now, here we go. Let me, sorry, I meant leave highlights by creating darker tones elsewhere. Let me catch up with what's happened in the drawing. So what I'm doing here now is measuring between the eye socket and the nostril is how I created the space between the patches for the eyes and the nose. Those aren't the eyes that you're seeing there, the eye sockets and the shadow that collects beneath the eye sockets. And then for the nose, I just shade around the nose itself. For the lips, I do actually shade the top lip, but then I shade around the bottom lip. Not around all of it, but around most of it, because only part of the bottom lip has some light which shines off the kind of bulge which is facing upward and outward, whereas the top lip faces downward usually. Even though it bulges outward, it just catches a lot more shadow. I create these soft indents around the lips and then also for the cheekbones, and then start to shade in very light around one side of the nose. This is establishing a shadow side so that we can start to create where the light is emanating from. It's a really important part of drawing. Where's the light coming from? And more often than not, it's coming from above, but in a drawing, it's nice for it to come from one side more prominently. And that's what I've established by shading the left side of the nose, or if the model were a real person, it would be their right side. But for us, it's the left side of the nose. And then I'm using this very light. Now, I'm not holding the pencil where the eraser is at the end, but I am holding it very lightly and wobbling it along to get a really light coverage of shading, just like I did at the beginning of the video, so that you can show the difference, or see the difference even, between the eye sockets, the shadow under the nose and around the lips, compared to where it's on the skin and there's no crevices or kind of canopies where it will create puddles of shadow beneath it. Now inside of the eye sockets, we're going to start to develop the actual eyeball here. And this may look as though you're drawing outlines, but what you're actually drawing is shadow. So that's not an outline, that is actual tone which is created. Just like the face may look like I've drawn an outline, but it's actually just tonality for the face. And that's just what naturally is there, because light won't create brilliant white on the face so that it's a blinding lightness. It just won't do that. The lightest parts of the face will be the most direct, or the parts of the planes of the face which are most close to the light and also directly facing the light, which just means that as your cranium turns, whatever point of the cranium is closest to facing the direct light source will have the strongest point of light, and everything below the cranium, which is further away from the light, won't have as strong a light highlight. Now that's not something which you represent very often in drawing, but it's something to be mindful of when you're creating something which you want to reflect reality to a certain extent. Now a lot of this structure which I'm drawing in the eyes I have covered in a recent video, and I will put a link here. This link is where I show in a very short video how to structure the eye in case you aren't exactly sure of how to create this type of nuance in the shading of the eyelid, the eyeball, the eye socket, and different creases and crevices that occur. It's not a technical study which I do, it's just a very quick basic structure that I create to show how I consider drawing an eye and the different planes that occur in that study. Now here again, because I've created a loose hairline, I'm trying to establish here the blend between the skin, the face, and the hair. And this is not dark. This is one of the problems that I see happen with a lot of people who draw when I'm looking around online at people's artwork, is the more amateur looking artwork is usually some of the knowledge that you build up when you start to attend portrait drawing sessions. I did that very, very often before attending university. And one of the things that I learnt was that the tonal difference between the colour of the skin and the colour of the hair is a very gentle blend until you get into the bulk of the hair where the tone changes more dramatically. So you want to keep the shading very light when the hair begins, and then you can darken it more significantly higher up. Now the hair's quite big on one side at the moment, but that's all part of sculpting, and you can erase it, and create it into a different shape. This isn't about doing a one-stroke drawing where everything is proportional immediately. It's something which we can build upon and make use of the eraser to try to push things around a little bit more. And you can see here there aren't really any clear outlines, and things that do look like outlines are truly where shadow forms. It's actually more true to how you would view a face in real life, is to see that shadow collects in certain areas and you build upon that. And because the drawing is so light, it's such a light mid-tone that you start to shade those areas, and it's not an outline, it's actually the structure of the face showing where the light does not reach and create these really bright highlights. And then it's a case of working the nuance of the face. Again, the eyes are a very important part. It's probably the focal part of portraits, because you want to look at people's eyes and feel humanity. So that's where I put a little bit more effort into the rendering, is in the eyes. But as you go around your drawing, you will see several different things that need addressing, and that's all I'm doing here as well. So as much as I started working in the shadow side of the eye, I then think, well, I do have a shadow side of the face, and I need to establish something a bit clearer there. So when it comes to not drawing with an outline, you want to make the most of your tonal range. And in order to do that, I created darker mid-tone. So the mid-tone that I created initially was that really light shading, and this is just a grade darker of a mid-tone to differentiate it from the brow, which is lighter. And as you go lower down the face, the shadows become darker. This is a good practice to create more depth more texture, more tone and more realism in your portraiture. And that's something which is, again, very nuanced on the nose, and you have to be very light and careful about how you shade the nose, because ideally you wouldn't be using a soft pencil like I'm using here, but because this is just a study and a demonstration, I thought I will go with the very, very light shading that I showed at the exercise at the beginning, and then start to continue my way down the mouth, the chin, and around the crevices, around the cheeks and around the mouth there, just to show how the shadow creeps around, but you don't want it to be too heavy yet. You want to try to build that up slowly. It's the same with the ear. It's on the dark side of the face. It shouldn't be catching too much light. There are certain highlights. This is all worth observing yourself and seeing what you can see when it comes to knowing about these landmarks on people's faces, like the shadow side and certain highlights in certain places, certain parts of the anatomy. So I'm drawing the little creases that occur between the eyebrows, and that creates this little bulge in between the two creases called the glabella. Now, it doesn't matter that it's called the glabella. That's not the important part. The important part is that if you can include that in your portraiture, then it creates more depth to the person. All I'm doing here is creating a darker shadow on the edge of the shadow side, because what happens with shadows is that usually you have reflected light occur on the shadow side very subtly, but it means that the difference between the midtone or the light midtone that you create on the skin and the darker midtone, in between those two, there is this shadow edge where shadow goes slightly darker. Now, it doesn't have to be as slight if you want it to create some drama in your drawing, and that's kind of what I've done here. I've done it a little bit wider than I need to, but it's trying to show this is where the shadow occurs on the face. And just as a quick demonstration, I know I'm making excuses for a little bit of a sketchy drawing, but it gives you an example of what I mean when it comes to shadow coverage. And I think this is what creates a more effective face. Now, I am obviously drawing from imagination here, but when you draw faces, you'll see certain parts of this, especially with good lighting. And as I said earlier, you want to try and capitalize on the most important elements of the portrait. And to me, the eyes, again, are something which you continually go back to. One thing which does happen when you're drawing faces is that as you create tone all over the face, everything needs to shift. So even if you've covered the eyes before, you'll find that they fade as everything else becomes darker. And as everything else does shift in tone, which means that it goes slightly darker, you'll need to return back to the eyes in order to create that distinction again between just shading and something which is a humanity or a focal point. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is to concentrate on slight aspects of the portrait in order to convey the importance of seeing someone's personality and emotions in their eyes. Slight things like touches under the eyebrows and then the actual pupil itself can be an important element of that. Now, everything's still very light at the moment on the face, so it's going to take a lot more work in order to create this illusion of texture on the skin, but a lot of the groundwork has been put down. So I say a lot more work. Most of the work has been done at this point, and all we need to do is start to go in with slightly darker tone in really important places. So these little hooks underneath the ear, you'll see a couple of these downward hooks that occur in the ear, and those are very important to get in there because those will define the ear shape with a type of illusion, because you're not fully drawing the ear. You just want to convey that a shape is happening here, a shadow is collecting there. Things like that are more powerful than something which is clearly drawn. Now, as I shade around certain aspects, it creates a suggestion of an outline, but in truth, you really can either use that as cutting in, which means that you're shading outside of the face and therefore sculpting the shape of the face, or you can push that shading into the ear to make it darker. Basically, in this drawing, I haven't had the nib down to draw an outline, but I am making the slight mistake of shading darker outside of the ears, so forgive me there. that's not actually necessary. It's just something which occurred. And as much as I'm trying to be a proponent of not doing outlines, there are slight suggestions of outlines here and there, but it's not something which you're drawing the face with the outline. I think this still should qualify, hopefully, but if there's any gripes about this, then I will gladly do another demonstration without those, because they're not necessary. And so long as you're confident about where you're actually applying certain markers of the anatomy, you don't need that. Shading again under the face and into the chin is something which, not into the chin, sorry, under the neck and towards the collar, is something which I think I really like to explore with darker tonality. At the moment, can you see how on the right side of the neck it's white? That's not actually what will happen on the neck. You'll have to have some light mid-tone coverage on there, but that'll take some working. So I will return to that in a moment. There's always going to be parts of the face, and especially, as I said earlier, the eyes, which will just need more attention. You can see I'm holding the pencil differently, how you normally hold a pencil throughout most of your life, which is pointing the nib down. For the majority of this drawing, I will encourage you not to do that. I always suggest that people hold the pencil very flat to try to use the width of the nib and create this tonal texture and create these shadow puddles all over the face before you go in with the nib down, because that just creates immediate tone. It's very, very difficult to get light shading with the nib down, and I don't think it works out any better or more effective when you do it that way. I think it's more effective when you have the nib flat. You can cover a larger surface area, and it spreads on very nicely and can be used in several different ways, and really nice gestural drawing as well. And for this, we're not doing gestural drawing, but we are doing the shadow puddles and the texture. So having the difference between the nib sat flat and the nib down is what is the effective kind of practice that we're trying to utilize. And again, here I'm doing what some people call the Terminator line, which is the very dark edge of shadow that occurs between the planes of the light mid-tone and the mid or darker mid-tone shadow that is created on the face. And you can start to see here how it's creating more depth, just because we have these layers of light mid-tone, dark mid-tone and darker shadow. Now I've created dark mid-tone in about 2 or 3 different tones there, so that it goes from dark grey in about 3 different layers of dark grey, and then there's the darkest shadow which I'm using for just below the eyebrow on the left hand side into the eyelid, and then obviously for the pupils. But I'm trying to keep that very restricted so that your eyes focus on those darker sections. And there are certain things which draw the eye to parts of drawing or painting or any kind of image that you may create, and one of those things is contrast. By that I mean when dark and light are sat next to each other, the highest contrast of that, the lightest against the darkest areas, will draw your eye. And here we're trying to not do very light against very dark, which means that you're trying to draw the eye to the area where it's darkest, because that will create the most drama and depth, and it will have a subtle amount of character and texture that it lends to the drawing when you have these several different applications of tone that we played with at the start of the video. Here I'm just trying to develop the hair slightly more so that we have something which is tonally suggesting a shadow side to the face as well. Now I don't go all the way into a deeper, more carefully rendered face in this, but it shows how everything that we've got here is an underdrawing until you start to add more pressure, commit to certain lines and measurements, and then have this face which is sculpted from the original underdrawing. And you can see here, instead of an outline, what I'm doing there is shading in from the outside of the hair into the kind of face direction more. That's really bad, into the face direction, in the direction of the face, so that it's not an outline, it is the start of where the hair is tonally darker, and it basically feeds that shadow inward. So that's what I'm trying to do. Even though the hair was a strange wider shape than this, if you go darker at a certain edge, that will define where the hair is, and you can either erase the lighter mark on the outside, or keep them, because in certain drawings I do think that it's much nicer to have tone outside of the subject than to have white. But in this drawing it's just going to be the subject, so that's why I'm not really going to be creating any tonality outside of this face that I'm creating here. But here I'm just working slightly, as you can see, more on the tonality of the neck, and it's all very light shading. Again, I really encourage you not to press down if you're doing darker shading, because you can create this illusion by just lightly shading over and over again over the top of the same patch of shadow, and it may not look like it's happening. So be patient and keep with the technique. Just trust the process, and just know that if you continually do that, it becomes darker and it doesn't go shiny, which is really what you're trying to do. Plus, you don't want to do a heavy dark shadow as if you have really strong light on the face, like a spotlight, because that's unnatural lighting. So what we're trying to do instead is create the illusion of the shadow being cast from the face, but it's not strong enough to be black shadow, because that's really not what you see very often on a face. It's more likely to be a dark mid-tone that happens on the neck. Not always. You can judge that by either reference or by the drama and atmosphere that you're trying to create in your drawing. But in this one, I'm just trying to give you some of the ideas that I consider when I'm drawing faces, and especially some of the range of tonality and how to create a face from imagination. Because if you're drawing along with this, there is a chance that you've now got this face front on from imagination, and I think that's lovely, to create faces and personalities that once weren't there, and you just conjure that out of thin air. That's something which I really appreciate and enjoy doing, because I didn't think of this face beforehand. I didn't imagine this face from anywhere. There's no reference for this person. It just happens as part of the process of drawing, is that you explore the eye sockets and then the distance between the eye sockets and the nostrils, and then you start to build up the features, and the face just comes out of it as you work it. And here I am erasing the outside of the hair there, so that's the part which I said you can either do that or keep it or add more tone as well. But I'm just erasing it there just to show you how ideally the tonality of these things aren't necessarily outlines, they just become part of the tone of these features. I think it creates quite a nice image for a face as well, as far as style. If this isn't the style that you want to draw, then maybe there's something else that you can get from this video, because there are several different styles, and that's one of the most important things. If someone says to me that they want to draw better, which has happened before, the most important thing I try to ask them next is, what do you want your artwork to look like? Is there an artist who you think, something in this genre I'd like to draw? And for me, it's either Stan Prokopenko, or, I mean, this is more of a Stan Prokopenko amateur style of what he does for drawing, because he does very nice tonality and he won't show the hatching lines. He'll do very nice blending. Or if you want to go even further into that type of magic, then you have Gabriella Handel or Stephen Bauman, or, there are several artists out there who do drawings where they do this kind of technique, but to a much, much greater level. And sometimes I don't want to do this style. Sometimes I'd rather do a style like Ian McHugh, or someone who's got a lot more of an abrasive touch, which is not a criticism. It means that you will see the marks, but that's part of the beauty, and it's less realistic, but it can sometimes have more character and personality. So it really does depend, and I'm not rigid with my goals when it comes to portraiture. I like to explore different styles, but this is the one which I'm showing in this video because I think it's important to have this type of knowledge to either use or to only utilize in certain ways and partly adopt for your portraiture, because you can do a lot more of a either caricature style or a cartoony style, or that Ian McHugh abrasive style of drawing faces, or skewing proportions, and then use the knowledge from this type of study in order to improve upon that. just because you may have followed this drawing, it doesn't dictate how you draw faces. That's all I'm trying to say, really. Now, there's always going to be more things that you notice. So you can see here, I go back in because I think, this ear really could catch nicer shadow in certain areas to show the anatomy. You don't have to necessarily worry about following every step of what I'm doing here. It's just that I can't leave things alone once I start them. You always look at it and think, this should actually go darker, and I could clean that up slightly more. And I've shaded a kind of strange crop for the neck. You see how it's sort of straight? I always like to curve the neck there, so it's kind of like a crew neck shading. Not a perfect crew neck, but just to round it at the bottom there. So that's all I'm doing here, is just lightly shading over certain parts. But there we are. That is how I would draw a face without using outlines, and I encourage you to try it out as much as possible. It doesn't have to be a face from front on. It works from any angle. It works for life drawing. It works for buildings and all drawing that you will ever try.